In my last lecture, I gave you a shockingly brief introduction to Hinduism and Buddhism, focusing especially on some of the beliefs they share. Just to recap, both religions have an essentially cyclical view of history and spiritual reality. Individuals are caught up in a cycle of rebirth driven by their karma, or the justice of their actions. Buddhism's iconic symbol, shown here on the right, is the Dharma wheel, or the wheel of karmic justice. Buddhist and Hindu worship patterns both focus heavily on circumnambulation, walking in a circle around an image, an imitation of the cycle of life and of the turning of the heavens. So how does this contrast with the Judeo-Christian worldview that has shaped Western culture? How do Westerners view history and the passage of time? Well, Westerners are much more linear in their thinking. Creation is a beginning in time, indeed the beginning of time, a biblical notion that 20th century Einsteinian physics has somewhat confirmed. Christians and Jews and Muslims share with Buddhists and Hindus a belief that what we do in this life matters for our eternal destiny, but generally believe that we only have one shot at getting it right. To understand Hinduism and Buddhism, we need to get inside the cyclical view of the natural and spiritual world. I think this image of Shiva as the Lord of the Dance is a great place to begin, not least because it is one of Hinduism's most iconic images. This image is filled with complex iconography, and we'll get there in a minute, but it also tells a story. If you didn't have time to watch this video clip last class, try it. It's up on Moodle. You can guess what these stories tell, right? David slaying Goliath, Noah loading up the ark, shepherds viewing baby Jesus in the manger. Seeing these images conjures up a familiar narrative for most of us. The same would be true of Hindu images for men and women who were raised on these religious narratives from childhood. So let's briefly recap the Shiva narrative. Not all of this was in the cartoon version, and there are lots of variations on the story. Shiva came to the forest to confront a group of wise men who had been neglecting proper worship. These wise men or sages sent a series of creatures to attack Shiva. First they sent a tiger, which was how Shiva ended up wearing a tiger skin. Then they sent a monstrous snake, which Shiva turned into a necklace. Finally they sent an evil dwarf. Shiva made short work of him as well. With all his foes defeated, Shiva began his creative and destructive dance. And here's where we see the cyclical worldview of Hinduism. Shiva is a creator, a preserver, and a destroyer, all at the same time. This triple identity makes sense when rebirth always follows and indeed demands death in order to preserve a cycle of life. This 17th century Hindu hymn sums up Shiva's 5 sacred actions, which are also highlighted in the sculpture. Note that all of his roles play a part. He creates the world with his sacred drum, he protects creation with his hand upraised in the do not fear mudra, and he destroys with the hand that bears the sacred fire. This slide gives you close-ups of the iconography of the work. The circle of flame surrounding Shiva, called a nimbus, symbolizes the boundaries of the cosmos, while the fire he bears in his hand destroys samsara, the cycle of birth, and maya, illusion. The dwarf, representing this illusion that leads humankind astray, is trampled under one foot, while with another lifted foot, Shiva signals the coming liberation from samsara into moksha. This and other small portable images of Shiva were not created to sit in museums. They were and still are dressed in fine clothing and paraded through the streets during festivals. While Hindus do not believe that a temple image is actually a god, they do believe that the god may inhabit that image for some periods. A temple image will be gently awakened in the morning, will receive gifts of food and flowers, and will be ritually bathed. And when a statue of a god has been transformed in a special ceremony by an enlightened guru into a living presence of the deity, then it becomes an important focal point for worship in a temple or in a small household shrine. What's so intriguing about the notion of darshan is that the worshiper not only sees the god in the image, but is seen by the god in return. So we need to move on to Hindu temples, but first let me talk briefly about the lost wax bronze casting technique, which was used to make the Hellenistic boxer and the African sculpture we will encounter next unit as well. It's on the right. Basically, an artist makes a wax mold of the image. This is carefully packed into clay or plaster, which is allowed to dry, and then hot metal is poured into the mold through a hole in the top. The metal melts the wax and takes its place, conforming to the sculpted shape. The artist then pounds off the dry clay or plaster and finishes the image with fine tools. Now on to temples. India is filled with Hindu temples of varying styles. The Lakshmana temple is a northern-style temple, which means it has tall, fluted towers that imitate sacred mountains, and it's part of a famous complex of temples built by a dynasty that ruled central India from the 9th to the 13th century. Khajuraho was their first capital, and the massive building program these rulers undertook was designed both to gain the favor of the gods for the rulers and to demonstrate the rulers' piety and their wealth and power. So let's watch an introduction to Hindu temples created by the Asian Art Museum. So the College Board has not given us much guidance about which of these complicated terms you need to memorize, but I think it would be smart to remember the Garbhagriha, which means womb chamber. It's the inner sanctum where the image of the god resides, really similar to a temple's cella. Directly above the divine image in the Garbhagriha is the imagined axis of the world. It links the center of the earth to the human realm and above them to the heavens. The axis travels through the Garbhagriha's towering roof, which is called a shikara. Smaller towers cover the mandapas or hypostyle halls leading to the Garbhagriha. Each of these towers also symbolizes a cosmic mountain. Note that the structure is elevated on a platform or plinth, and that's like the stylobate of a Greek temple. This is pretty much the same set of labels, this time on a photograph. Don't worry about further terms. This is not, by the way, the image in your workbook. It's been recently added by Khan Academy, and I liked it. So here is a helpfully labeled floor plan. Now the space labeled sanctum here is the Garbhagriha. It's a small space, often a perfect square, windowless and enclosed. Unlike the rest of the temple, it is without ornamentation. The womb space represents universal essence and is kept very plain. Worshippers walk around, that is, they circumnambulate the image, seeing and being seen in an act of darshan. The mandapas are the hallways leading toward the inner sanctum. Often they have internal pillars, that is, they are hypostyle halls. Note again that the smaller towers rise over the entry halls. So here's how one scholar explains the artistic and spiritual logic behind Hindu temple design. A Hindu temple is built around the belief that all things are one. Everything is connected. The pilgrim is welcomed through mathematically structured spaces, a network of art, pillars with carvings and statues that display and celebrate the four important and necessary principles of human life: the pursuit of artha, prosperity, wealth; the pursuit of kama, pleasure, including sensual pleasure; the pursuit of dharma, virtue, the ethical life; and the pursuit of moksha, which is release from samsara and the acquisition of self-knowledge. So let's return to our video, which relates the form of the temple to its religious functions. Here's the approach to the Garbhagriha and the Lakshmana temple. Note the hypostyle hall of the mandapa or hall. And here's a plan for the wider temple area. Note that there is a central temple surrounded by 4 smaller shrines. The term Pachayatana caught me by surprise. It showed up in one of the College Board questions from this unit. I had never encountered it before, and it didn't show up in any of the readings. The term refers to a temple design where a central temple or shrine is surrounded by 4 smaller shrines. Now we both know. By the way, you see my frustration. It's hard for me to know exactly what you need to know. I'll do my best. So does this design remind you of any of the other temples we've studied? So what's the temple on the top, and how is it similar to the Lakshmana temple? It's the temple of Amun-Re at Karnak, right? Note that it has the same essentially rectilinear axial structure, where the worshipper is drawn through pillared hallways to an ever darker inner space. In both temples, the design reflects and reinforces the spiritual journey toward the god. What's another similarity? Think power and authority. Well, both temples were built by powerful rulers to bolster their claim to hold the favor of the gods, and of course to demonstrate the rulers' devotion to the gods and their willingness to spend their wealth on their behalf. And yes, this really is a College Board image, you don't blame me, but also don't assume that these erotic sculptures meant that this was the Chandela King's version of the Playboy Mansion. Let's watch another video clip which explains the religious significance of these carvings. So Shilpa Shastras are Hindu texts that lay out rules for artists and craftsmen. They include rules about perfect canons for buildings and for sculptures for the human body. In other words, it's another canon of proportions. As the quote indicates, the images of loving couples were part of an iconography that promoted spiritual achievement in all phases of life. The Chandela kings were also heavily influenced by tantric philosophies, which divided the cosmos into male and female principles. Interestingly, while men were viewed as having form and potential, which was an essentially passive role, it was women who were viewed as possessing the active energy that brought the world into being. The mutual cooperation of men and women and their joining was necessary for existence. As your reading pointed out, the bodies were not entirely naked. They are always adorned. The fighting lion is the symbol of the Chandela dynasty. Note that the lion appears to be winning. The Chandela claimed to be descended from the union between a god and a mortal woman, shades of the Greeks and Romans. At any rate, these temples are clearly a statement about power as well as piety.